If you want to find out how we took this warehouse and transformed it into this to get shots like these, then stick around because I'll be breaking down exactly how we lit this shot from the gear that we used, which by the way will surprise you at how minimal it is, to the camera settings, as well as all the small tips and tricks that we used and learned throughout this process. Now, if you haven't seen the full commercial, I highly recommend you do so. It is live on our Instagram and our website, and you can find those links in the description down below. With that being said, let's dive into our wide lighting setup, which will serve as the foundation for our whole shoot. And to shoot this whole commercial, we use my Canon R5C with a 24 to 70mm Sigma lens. Now, I wanted to lean into the characteristics of this lens, which is the fact that it is an incredibly ultra sharp, beautiful, pristine lens. And so because of that, I didn't put anything in front of my camera to affect it. And that is because I wanted to create this very harsh world in this warehouse, and I felt that the sharp quality of that lens was helping create that look. Another thing that we did to bring that sort of feeling to life is we've made it look very cold. This is something that we definitely amplified and pushed further in grade, but we set the foundations by having our camera balanced to 4,400 Kelvin. And then the final touch that we did in camera to help sell that feeling is instead of shooting at f2.8 where we make everything look smooth and blurry and ultra cinematic, we actually shot at f4 to give a little bit more sharpness to the image. Now, one of the things that I did in terms of lighting actually happened before we actually started recording, and it was an absolute game changer that made our whole production day so much smoother, especially because we're a small crew of 3 people, myself, a behind the scenes person, and the actor, and that was pre-visualization. Now, what that means is basically I lit the shot before we actually got onto production. And to do this, I used a software called Satellite. The real benefit of previs is instead of me spending 80% of my time on set problem solving and trying to get the look to look good, I've already done that in pre-production. So I'm spending 80% of my time refining and getting the extra juice to get my images popping and looking even more beautiful. Having done all that previs, we knew exactly what we were going to set up, and the first light was an Amaran 300C with a Fresnel attachment. And the reason why I chose to use a Fresnel attachment over a spotlight attachment is because we wanted some natural fall off that you get with the Fresnel light while still being able to have a direct beam of light that we could focus or flood depending on what we were trying to do. And that's what's giving us these highlight spots here on the metal frame, as well as creating this long straight shadow over here and on the beam over there. Now, besides giving us these very harsh shadows and pop-up highlights in the background, what it was also doing was creating a hard light on our subject. And you can see it on his face, on his fingers, on his torso, on his legs. There's a very harsh beam of light, and then our contrast ratio is very high because we fall right into shadow very quickly. It's not a soft gradual fall off, and that was done intentionally because this is the wide. We're not really focusing on the beauty side of the image. We're trying to sell a world, so we're lighting for the space, not for the face. But I also wanted to still create some separation. And so to create that separation, but also draw a little bit more attention to the center of the frame, we took our second light, which is the Amaran F22C with a grid attachment, and we rigged it directly overhead. Now, setting this light was actually one of the first challenges that we had in terms of lighting. In previs, I had rigged this up on a C-stand and I didn't see it in my image. But that is because I used the wrong C-stand that had a longer boom arm. And so when I actually rigged it up, I could see a C-stand. Now, this is where we had to get a little bit creative with the gear that we had to solve the problem. Last resort, the shot was static, so we could have left the C-stand in there and just made sure that it wasn't conflicting with any shadows, and then in post-production removed the C-stand. However, I didn't want to have to deal with the C-stand later in other shots where that wouldn't be a possibility. And we had to get creative with our rigging, and we got lucky with our location. As you can see in the location, we have these 2 shelvings that we're using to create a frame within the frame. Now, you can't see it here on the frame, but these shelves are actually connected by a series of metal bars. So we clamped the maffer to the metal bar tight. Now, the maffer clamp has a little spigot that sticks out of it, and what we did is took our first grip head, tightened it onto that spigot, fed a grip arm across it, and then used the spare grip head to connect the F22C directly overhead. To make sure that this was safe, we counterbalanced using a sandbag, and we also rigged it up with some safety chains just in case anything slipped and the thing fell on our actor. Now, besides that, we also used a full stop of diffusion on the Amaran F22C because I like the quality of the light as it goes through that diffusion, and we used the grid to control the light so that it wasn't spilling everywhere, but it was creating a spotlight. And you can see that that light is basically creating this highlight on the hair, on the shoulder, but it's also just taking a slight bit of the edge off on the face because it was really just off screen. And that's also what's creating this large spotlight effect on the image. The final lights that we added to our shot were these Amaran P2Cs here in the background that act as practicals. And these were a last minute addition. And I looked at my image and I felt that the background felt a little bit too flat. It didn't look as nice. And I wanted to add something to create visual interest. And because I was using these Amaran P2Cs for other setups, I had them with me and I decided to chuck them in the background as practicals. And they they really worked wonders. They created another layer of the frame and they illuminated the background a little bit more, giving it just a little bit more spice. Now, when it comes to the settings of each of these lights, all of the lights were white balanced to the exact same setting of 6,000 Kelvin. I wanted to create that blue, so I intentionally offset the lights to feel cooler compared to my white balance. Now, the Amaran 300C was set to 100% intensity, and the reason why is because of the distance in relation to the subject, but also because I needed that light to give me a bit more kick in the background. So we needed to have that light really at full blast. The Amaran F22C was actually set at 50%, and I felt that that gave a really seamless blend where it felt like that light was just an extension of the key light while also still creating a nice spill on the floor without feeling overblown. And the P2Cs were set at 25% so that they weren't running too hot, but they were still getting enough juice to lift up the shadows of the background just a smidge. So let's look at how we built on the foundation of this lighting setup for the close-ups. So this is our close-up, and as you can see, we still have our main light coming from the left side of the frame as it was from the wide shot. But one of the main differences that you'll notice is that the light, while still feeling directional, is much softer. It doesn't have such a harsh transition between highlight to shadow. Now, in terms of the actual lights that we were using, we're still using the exact same lights. In fact, I haven't moved any of the light. We still have the Amaran F22C over the top here, which is creating our hair light. We still have the Amaran 300C here on the side with the same Fresnel attachment at the exact same intensity, which is keying our subject. So if we didn't change any of our light fixtures between the wide and the close-up, how did we make the quality of light feel different? And if you're ever running a small crew, this is a law that I live by. It is keep it stupid simple. So I spent most of my time dialing in that wide shot, which became the foundation of my lighting setup, so that when I went to the close-ups, when I went to the product shots, I didn't have to do massive rehold. I could do the subtle things and it would give me way more impact. So to get this soft look, we simply brought in a backdrop stand that I got on Amazon. I think it's an E-Mart one that you can get for like 30 bucks and it can go up to like 3 meters or 4 meters. And I bought a $5 shower curtain and I draped it over the backdrop stand. And that is what's creating this soft look while still keeping that directional quality of the light. And another benefit of this shower curtain is because these glasses are quite reflective and they're kind of the eyes of the character, it's creating a gradient that brings the shape to the glasses. And you can see it here in this highlight streak that's being created by the gradient of the light hitting the shower curtain and wrapping and falling off, making just the eyes of the character come to life and giving it a little bit more depth. One thing that we did with the shower curtain is we actually kept a little bit of that hard quality of light still straying through, and that's what's bringing up some of the highlight level here on the bars in the background. And that was all we did to get this lighting set up. It was a simple bring in one extra item and it changed the whole look, and that is all we did to get a softer look on our subject. And you can see there's a bit of a harshness to the light here, but as it falls off, it's falling off a little bit more gradual, making it feel a bit more pleasing. And if I was gonna get even closer to the subject, let's say going from a medium to an actual close-up, all I would do is just keep bringing that shower curtain closer to the subject so that we're getting a nicer wrap. So that's how we lit the main talent of the commercial, but we also were shooting a product in this environment, and that had its own approach that we need to look at. So let's dive into the product shot. So here we have our product shot. In order to be able to shoot in slow motion, what we first did was, instead of shooting at 25 frames per second like we shot the whole commercial, we moved it up to 120 frames per second. As soon as we made this change, because we were shooting at a higher frame rate, it also meant that there was less light hitting the sensor at a time, which means that our exposure dropped significantly. So to compensate for this, the R5C has dual base ISO. It has 800, which is what we were shooting at 25 frames per second, and the second base ISO is 3200, which is what we were using when we were shooting at 120. And that made the image look relatively the same as when we were shooting 800. Now, in terms of how the lighting setup changed between the talent to the product, we still used the Amaran 300C and the F22C in relatively the same positions. The big thing that happened is that we brought them closer. So for example, instead of having the F22C rigged up on that metal bar, we actually de-rigged it and put it back on a C-stand so that we could bring it a lot closer to the image and get a lot more juice from that light, especially because we were shooting slow motion. I wanted to be able to get as much exposure out of that light as possible. And that is what's creating this top light on the watch. And then we brought the Amaran 300C slightly closer. But the main change that we did is that this Fresnel light, when we were shooting the talent, was in between like a half spot, half flood. But here, I really wanted it to be a punchy beam. So we took this Fresnel light and we full spotted it, which created a very directional light. And you can see it here on the side of the watch. It's creating that ping of hard light, really giving it some depth and some shape. Now, as I mentioned, we were shooting slow motion, which means that we need more light to be able to expose the image properly. So the intensity of these lights was at 100%, and the lights that we brought in were also kept at 100% because we needed more output. We kept the same white balance across all of them, 6,000 Kelvin. Now, these two lights, as we've seen in the wide, are going to create a very contrasty image. And when you're shooting a product, you don't want that. You want people to be able to see the product in its full glory, appreciate it, get a sense of what it looks like and how it feels. So the first light that we brought in to do that was an Amran P2C. And we wanted to control the light because a tube light usually has a very large soft spill. So in order to do that, we used a 45 grid attachment to get a little bit more control and direction on the light. And that is what's creating this little highlight sliver here on the watch. And again, giving it a little bit more separation, making the watch feel a lot more three-dimensional. However, once we set that up, this watch face originally was super dark. You couldn't see anything, which is a problem when you're advertising a watch. So to fix that, we did two things. One is that we had my camera dead center to the watch. We took a little bit of polyboard and we made a cutout for the lens and we stuck it right on the camera. And basically what that was doing was returning any light that was ambiently hitting that styrofoam, and it was bouncing back and front lighting the watch, allowing us to see the face a lot clearer. And that's what's creating these little pings of lights here on the bolts of the watch, as well as this illumination strip here at the bottom where it was catching that light a lot more perfectly. And then the second thing we did is we added an actual key light. Technically, that Amran 300C, whilst it was the key light for all the rest of the setup, it was more acting as a backlight and also allowing us to see the smoke, because when you light smoke, you want to light it from the opposite direction of the camera so that it's not washed out and actually has shape. So we took another Amran P2C over here, but this time without a grid because I wanted it to be as soft as possible. And then we took a 5-in-1 diffusion and let that light source go through there and illuminate that watch from the front. And that's what's catching this dial here and allowing us to see more clearly what the watch is. So that was the exact setup that we did for these lights. And that is everything that we did to light the wides, the close-ups, and the product shots for this specific section of the commercial. If you haven't seen it already, again, links are in the description. Also, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all that funky, funny stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.